My roommate has been in the bathroom for over 4 hours. I got home around 11 p.m. A late night at the office turned into an even later night at the bar. By this point, I had about 4 drinks and I was exhausted, nearly dozing off as I stumbled through the door. I collapsed onto the couch, reached for my pack of cigarettes, and lit one while opening YouTube on my laptop. I was watching a video about luxury yachts, nearly nodding off when I heard the front door open. I sat up slightly, just enough to see my roommate stepping inside. He hung his coat in the closet without saying a word, then slowly walked into his room. This was fairly normal. I'd been living with him for about 3 months, long enough to be familiar with most of his habits. The guy barely ever spoke unless spoken to, which wasn't a problem for me. He also kept his side of things clean and never caused much trouble. I really had no complaints. So I continued watching YouTube, and about 5 minutes later, I heard the sound of running water coming from his bathroom. Again, nothing strange. At this point, I was watching bare-knuckle boxing videos with half-closed eyes, just a minute or two away from passing out. I remember waking up in darkness, my head throbbing, my throat dry. I sat up slowly, waiting for the grogginess to subside a little. When I felt a bit better, I pulled out my phone to check the time. Around 3:30 a.m., if I remember correctly. I was hungry, so I got up and headed toward the fridge, and then I noticed it, a soft but constant sound. It took me a few seconds to recognize what it was. Running water. Suddenly, the events of the previous night started replaying in my mind. Drinking at the bar, taking an Uber home, the laptop, the couch, my roommate coming home, the sound of water running in the bathroom. I stood there for a moment, trying to make sense of it. Maybe he fell asleep and forgot to turn it off? I shook my head. No way, I thought. Maybe he slipped and fell? Realizing that possibility, I rushed to his door, but the bathroom door was locked. I started banging on it. Hey, you okay? No response. I considered breaking the door down, but decided to call 911 first. I pulled out my phone, ready to dial, when I noticed an unread message. A text from my roommate. Hey, I couldn't sleep, so I went to my girlfriend's place. Not sure when I'll be back. Sent 2 hours ago. I looked at the bathroom door, then back at my phone. Everything felt off. First, my roommate almost never texted me, especially not to tell me where he was going. Second, I was certain he was single and had been for a while. And third, who was in the bathroom? I tried calling him. No answer. I sent a message. No response. I walked over to his desk and saw his keys and wallet sitting next to his laptop. My mind started spinning at this point, and I backed away, returning to the living room and turning on the lights. I paced around, trying to assess the situation while also attempting to ignore the sound of running water, an ordinary noise that had somehow become terrifying in this context. After a while, I heard something vibrate on the kitchen counter. I approached and saw that it was a phone, my roommate's phone. Panic began rising in my chest, and I immediately grabbed my keys and ran out of the apartment. I hurried down the hallway, down to the lobby, but even that didn't feel far enough. I kept walking until I reached a McDonald's across the street. I sat there for a while, debating whether to call the police, but for some reason, I felt too anxious to do it. But even with so few people around, the place started feeling suffocating, so I decided to leave, stepping onto the empty street. Almost immediately, I felt like I was being watched. I looked up at the apartment building. Soon enough, I saw myself staring at the balcony, and there was someone standing there. A tall, rigid figure, so still that it almost looked like a mannequin. But it wasn't. If I looked closely, I could see it swaying ever so slightly. I froze in place, my mind struggling to comprehend or accept what I was seeing. That was definitely not my roommate. It was too tall. In fact, it was far too tall to be anyone I knew, its head nearly touching the bottom of the balcony above it. No matter how hard I tried, I couldn't make out any details. Maybe the darkness and distance were enough to explain that. But something made me come to a different conclusion, that this thing simply had no details to observe, that its body was composed of nothing but pure, featureless darkness. Of course, my instinct was to run as far away from it as possible, but a voice in my head told me that if I tried to flee, this thing would chase me. Instead, I turned back toward McDonald's, locking myself in the restroom as I finally dialed 911. I told the dispatcher that someone had broken into my apartment, but I had left without them noticing and that they were still in there. That was the most accurate way I could describe the situation without sounding insane. The dispatcher said they would send officers and told me to stay put. I left the restroom and waited at the nearest table by the exit until I saw the red and blue lights cut through the darkness. I stepped outside to meet the police, glancing up at the balcony, now empty, though the door to my living room was wide open. They asked me a lot of questions that I struggled to answer. Was the intruder armed? Did I have any idea who it could be? What was their intent? I told them I didn't know, that I couldn't understand, but they kept pressing. Soon, I was practically shouting at them to go up there and check right now. And I guess the fear in my voice was enough to make them take it seriously. They told me to wait at the entrance, and I watched them enter the building. I stood there for a long time, growing increasingly anxious about what they would tell me when they came back down. Minutes later, the silence was shattered by the muffled sound of a gunshot. My heart pounded, and I kept waiting in terror, unsure what else to do. 20 more minutes passed, and the officers still hadn't returned. Before long, I heard more footsteps approaching from the distance. Before I knew it, 4 more police cars had pulled up around my building, and the scene turned to chaos. Officers shouting at each other and into their radios, bombarding me with more questions that I couldn't answer. The next series of events was mostly a blur, but I remember the building being evacuated, residents panicked and confused as they were escorted out, while the officers became more and more frantic. I remember hearing more sporadic gunfire, screams, and other sounds I couldn't understand. There are gaps in my memory after that, but I recall being pushed into the back of a police car. After being taken to the station, I was led into an interrogation room where I found 2 men in suits waiting. They didn't introduce themselves. They immediately launched into a series of questions, each one stranger than the last. Where does your roommate work? What is the nature of his job? How many different people have entered your apartment since your roommate moved in? Have you ever heard voices in the apartment between midnight and 3 a.m.? Voices that did not belong to your roommate? Have you ever seen a group of people standing outside the apartment between midnight and 3 a.m.? Very tall people. And one of the most unsettling questions, have you ever seen someone standing at the foot of your bed when you woke up around midnight to 3 a.m., only for them to disappear a few seconds later? If so, do you remember what they looked like? Any distinguishing features? Now it's the next day and I'm in a hotel. Of course, I can't sleep, can't eat. The officer still hasn't called me. When I tried searching for news on the evacuation, all I found were articles saying it was due to a fire. A goddamn fire. I drifted off in exhaustion. When I woke up, my heart nearly stopped. It was 1 a.m. and I could hear running water.